For years now, one of the biggest things that your country was able to claim was having a nuclear triad, which, if you don't know, is one country's ability to use a nuke via a long-range bomber, an ICBM silo, and a submarine all at once. And it basically guarantees that at least one of those delivery methods is going to work. As it stands, there are 4 countries that have this: China, Russia, the United States, and India, apparently. Wasn't really expecting that one, but anyway. But I have a problem with this, because they just picked the polygon with the fewest amounts of sides possible, and they just stopped. Why didn't they keep going? The reality is that during the Cold War, countries around the world developed some pretty insane ways to deliver a nuclear weapon. You know, back when men were men, gasoline had lead in it, and lung cancer hadn't been invented yet. I will not rest until I can order a Waffle House all-star breakfast and rip darts at the same time. I need to stop getting sidetracked, but my point is, plane, submarine, and giant hole in the ground are only 3 of the dozens of ways people played around with how to kick off the actual end of the world. I'm going to be listing off some of my favorites, with the lists gradually becoming more absurd and obscure as we go along. By the end, hopefully you'll agree that we should not have stopped at just a triad. We should be at least a pentiad at the very least. I'll settle for 5. Before we get into that though, I need to make a non-creative transition to talk about today's sponsor, World of Warships. In case you didn't know, this week was Veterans Day, and World of Warships plans to celebrate by bringing in the Fat Electrician and Demo Ranch. You know, get it? Because he's a veterinarian. World of Warships is the premier naval combat game where you control massive fleets of history's most iconic warships. If you're like me and enjoy trying to find where video game designers modeled military equipment inaccurately, I have some bad news for you. Because you can't with World of Warships, because of the insane amount of detail and accuracy of graphics that went into each and every ship. Have you ever wanted to reenact the hit 1960s song Sink the Bismarck by Johnny Horton? Well, now you can, and if you're a first-time player, you can use the invite code VETS4VETS, and you'll get a starter pack with both Fat Electrician and Demo Ranch as playable commanders. In addition to 200 doubloons, 14 days of premium access, 2 million credits, and your choice of Tier 4 ship after 15 battles. Make sure you sign up this week for the Veterans Day special, and you'll get access to exclusive content, customizations, rewards, giveaways, and my personal favorite, the exclusive DD-214 ship. World of Warships is available on PC or console, so whatever fits your fancy. Join a massive active community battling it out in over 40 maps and 20 different ports, 10 of which are based on actual historical places. Each week you'll receive a new set of missions, game updates, and special events to always keep things fresh for you and your buddies. Follow my link in the description and download World of Warships today. Starting off the list fairly strong, we have nuclear landmines, aka the atomic demolition munition. Its purpose isn't really to destroy things as it is to deny movement corridors. And by that I mean literally nuking mountain passes, bridge networks, dams, and any other bits of infrastructure that make it easier for an enemy's army to go from point A to point B. Not only did it create physical barriers, but the radiological leftovers would be fairly significant, meaning that any movement through the crater would require units to be in full NBC kit, which makes just everything infinitely harder and way more miserable for Joe Schmo, who now has to wear a full Seaburn suit. The Brits took their own turn at trying to develop the nuclear landmine, but one issue they ran into was that in the West German winters, the munitions would get too cold, meaning if the Reds came over during the holiday shopping season, the nukes would be kaput. To counter this, the idea was floated around to just stuff a bunch of chickens inside, which, if kept alive, would allow for just enough heat to be generated and keep everything running smoothly. Believe it or not, these nukes were actually designed with dual military and civilian use in mind. The idea was that instead of slowly and steadily mining for natural resources, you just blow a giant hole in the ground and start poking around. Think of it as super fracking. However, neither the military nor the commercial version actually went anywhere because, well, reasons. Now, these were meant to be used retroactively versus proactively. No one was about to start World War III with a nuclear landmine. But the Soviets had a plan on how to end it at least, or at least a plan of a plan. See, back in the 70s and 80s, the Soviets were really worried about American submarine-launched ICBMs. Because these things fire from unexpected locations, you can't inherently figure out where they're going to hit. The brass of the USSR assumed, probably not for a bad reason, that SLBMs would be used against them specifically, wherever they happen to be at the moment. Not only would it just be lights out for them, but it would make nuclear retaliation a lot harder, if not impossible, in certain scenarios. scenarios. Their solution was Dead Hand, or Perimeter in the actual Russian. This is your classic doomsday device, not so much in the Dr. Strangelove way, but in a dead switch way. In short, if it was found out that Uncle Sam decided that nuclear Armageddon seemed like a good idea that particular morning, Dead Hand would fire a command missile, and this missile would careen through the communist skies, broadcasting launch signals, and ensuring that even if the General Secretary had just experienced what the birth of a star felt like, those damn capitalists would get what was coming for them. Now, we don't know a lot about the actual intricacies of how this was supposed to work, but we do know one thing, and that is the programming logic behind how it would be activated. First, it would need to be turned on. Simple enough. If it was turned on, it would then try to figure out if the Soviet Union was just nuked by checking a series of seismic, radiological, and air pressure sensors. And if it was determined that it would then check to see if there was an open comms link with the Soviet General Staff. If the link was active and no other indications of an attack were detected, the machine assumed the staff were either alive or otherwise handling the situation after a given amount of time, somewhere between 15 minutes to an hour. If the link was dead, then the machine would just assume it was cowabunga time and initiate the launches. Now, in recent years, some former Soviet officials tried to explain that the Dead Hand system was semi-autonomous and still included some human interaction at some level, but the jury is still out on that one. To me, that just sounds like revisionist propaganda. Just claim you made a doomsday machine, that's way cooler. Now, this next one on the list is fairly well known at this point, that being the Davy Crockett launcher. There's a good chance you've at least heard of the nuclear mortar. The actual warhead, the projectile, atomic, super caliber 279mm XM388, as it was known, had an explosion equal to about 20 tons of TNT, and anything within 520 feet of impact would be instantly vaporized, with everyone else being allowed to enjoy the remaining minutes, hours, or handful of days of their lives succumbing to radiation poisoning. Now, on paper, allegedly, the crew would actually survive firing this munition, knock on wood. However, official Army manual still advised it was a good idea to take cover when you fired this thing. Fun fact, it also had a training version of the warhead that was just full of conventional explosives that, according to the manual, could be used against incoming soldiers if they really needed to. But if you ever have to use training ammo in self-defense, that's just a bad day at the office no matter how you frame it. You had two options of firing this thing, the M28 launcher and then later the M29 launcher, with ranges of 1.25 miles and 2.5 miles respectively. Personally, I would not enjoy being 1.25 miles away from a nuclear explosion, but that's just me. Additionally, these launchers could be slapped on the back of a Jeep for a quick getaway. Nuke Jeep, the technical to end all technicals. Much like everything else on this list, these warheads never actually got used, thankfully, and Davy Crockett's were more of an exercise in can we rather than should we, because it actually took a series of engineering miracles to get a warhead that small. The Army decided, though, it did not have enough soldiers and support personnel to spend on a weapon system that probably would not be used even if the Cold War went hot, as well as the, quote, great fear that some sergeant would start a nuclear war. Imagine if we gave one of these things to that kid who hijacked the bus during basic training. That would have been awesome. For this next one, we are going back to nuclear landmines, but instead of burying them, what if you just shoved them out the back of a plane attached to some guy? Back in the late 50s and 60s, the United States formed what were called green light teams, also known as atomic demolition munitions specialists. This was back when the new look strategy of nukes was gaining popularity. Basically, the military decided that while using full-size nukes would lead to nuclear war, using small tactical nukes would not only be a great way to celebrate a kill streak, but it would be below the threshold of a full-on nuclear retaliation. Now, I mentioned parachuting with these things strapped between your legs, and that is what they are most famous for, but green light teams trained to deliver them through transporting from the ground or even underwater. Different teams would train and specialize on different infiltration techniques. Teams even practiced delivering them on skis, but apparently this was hard, to no one's surprise, with one member later saying, "It skied down the mountain, you did not." A few different arming techniques were developed over the years for these things. Either mechanical timers or radio detonators would be used, and each method included redundant systems in case the primary triggering mechanism got fried from a nearby EMP from other nukes that were going off. If you can imagine, this is not the safest way to earn your paycheck. While part of the plan of these nukes included the two-man teams getting far enough away before detonating, most of them knew that if they ever actually had to perform this task, they probably were not coming home. Basically, the only way that any of them would survive the actual mission is if everything went absolutely perfectly, which they rarely did. The mechanical timers on these were highly fragile and had a margin of error of exploding 8 minutes too early or 13 minutes too late. I know which one of the two I would prefer though. If teams were told they needed to bury the nukes to achieve the desired effects, the resulting fallout from the explosion happening underground would very likely injure and or kill them, even if they made a perfectly clean getaway. For the majority of the green light teams, they all knew that this task was near suicidal. However, this is infinitely preferable to the original models of these nukes, which just had a 100-meter long piece of det cord to set it off, which isn't near suicidal, it's just suicidal. Now, nukes are really good at blowing up people's places and things, just as God intended. But there's been some ideas floating around of how to use them to make other things destroy nouns. Enter the nuclear torpedo, also known by some as the tsunami bomb, which sounds like a sushi roll you'd find in a landlocked state. These generally have two uses: taking out a carrier battle group in one hit, or as the name implies, inflicting catastrophic damage onto a port. The Americans and the British tried this out in the 1940s, but with lackluster results. But as explosions we could squeeze out of a nuke increased, so too did the idea that you could effectively flood a city with radioactive water in one nuclear explosion. The Soviets really got behind this idea in the 60s, but it wasn't until 2018 that the now Russia actually did something with it. Because in 2018, the Kremlin released plans for a nuclear torpedo called the Status 6. These underwater missiles would be both nuclear powered and nuclear armed, with a 100 megaton warhead. In theory, it's estimated that if you set one of these things off on a coastline, you can generate a 500-meter tall shockwave that would simulate the effects of an earthquake well enough and spawn in a tsunami. North Korea in 2023 pulled a test of its own underwater nuke called the Heil, or tsunami, which is a bit on the nose, but according to their reports, it generated a radioactive wave. Now, I'm not going to be here to split hairs over what makes something a wave and what makes something a tsunami. I will leave that to the experts, and by that I mean other people just talking at a camera on the internet. But funny story, one Egyptian magazine, the Al Asboa, claimed that in 2004, the Indian Ocean earthquake and resulting tsunami was caused by an underwater nuclear explosion, and they blamed the Indian government for it. However, you'll also find this article under the name of Top Conspiracy Theories of All Time, so maybe don't listen to them. Now, this last way of deploying a nuke will definitely appeal to my audience that have problems picking up social cues. Trains. The rail car launched ICBM, as it is affectionately known as, were solutions to one of the biggest problems of silo-based missiles. Everyone knows where they are, and they're going to be the first places hit if things go hot. ICBMs are massive, and while you can physically transport them from one place to another via a big truck, you can't launch them from one. Enter the mighty train. The idea was that these would be constantly moving, or hiding in tunnel sections, meaning anyone with a spy satellite or fancy weather balloon wouldn't be able to know where exactly they were. Trains are big and powerful enough that, in theory, they could transport not just the missiles themselves, but also the entire launching platform as a whole. The Russians managed to build a few of these back in the 80s, with the RT-23 Molodets being the most prominent, and the Americans tried their hand at it as well with the Peacekeeper rail garrison, which would disguise the launchers as just normal civilian cargo. Very sneaky, but it never actually went anywhere. I do like the picturesque oil painting that someone in the Air Force commissioned. I mean, just look at that skyline. These were okay in theory, but railroads are one of the easiest things to sabotage. Trains are easily predictable considering they only go on rails, and ensuring security of live nuclear weapons during peacetime along the entire railway network of the United States is easier said than done. Makes me wonder if Japan could just use a bullet train to lob a bomb somewhere while it's going at top speed, like a ghetto-rigged mass driver or something. Anyway, that's it for me. Make sure you check out today's sponsor, World of Warships, with my link below. Thank you for watching. Make sure you subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.